Welcome to everybody joining us. Well, usually there's sort of like an uptick over the first couple minutes and then it dies down and then you sort of know. It's like the waiting for a party to start. You wait for that like magic last person to show up
We don't have
that
a
really
kitchen.
makes you feel. Would you say?
We don't have a kitchen. We need a kitchen. Then everybody would
Right.
show up.
Yeah, exactly. 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 All right. Well, let's go ahead and kick it off here. Very excited, day 4. We've been doing these discussions online all week about the creative industries to sort of celebrate and think about the creative industries division starting. My name is Mike, and I work for an organization called Creative Startups. Everything has the same name. Don't know why. And we were tasked with developing a strategic plan for the new division, and it's been really exciting, being able to meet and talk with lots of people all across New Mexico. And that is actually the topic of our discussion this afternoon. I hope everybody, wherever you are in New Mexico, you're able to have some coolness and and you're, withstanding the heat wave, but the heat wave is different for everyone and just like everything is different for everyone in New Mexico. And that's what we're going to talk about today, just unique regional identities and sort of multiple New Mexico truths, if you will. And we're very excited to be joined by some real heavy hitters, people who thought a lot about regional identity, rural identity, tribal identity, statewide identity, and particularly in the realm of creative economy development all across the state. And so we're just going to go through and kick things off. First up, we've got Eva Artschwager from Cirrus Consulting, who is a rural community development and digital inclusion expert, and particularly has done a lot of work in northern New Mexico. And we're very excited for her to join us today and tell us a little bit about her thoughts on how all the different sort of players in this, both artists and creatives, and also the state and its various apparati, can sort of help develop better regional identities to drive economic development in more places across the state. So thank you so much for joining us today, Eva.
Well, thank you also, and I'm delighted to be here, and I'm happy to say a few words now, or okay. So I really want to call out creative industries and especially creative startups for setting this event up, and especially for the interesting way that the events and the questions have been framed, because I think a lot of us who work in this area often don't get a chance to really have those conversations about what's happening in the deeply rural communities. As Mike mentioned, my background is varied. I do digital inclusion work, but really as part of a larger package of rural community and economic development work, which is tends to be a rather messy definition. I won't give one. I know many people, when I tell them what I do, they come back a couple days later and say, I still don't understand what that is. The question that I considered in thinking about this was sort of how thinking about community and rural development from a regional perspective, and specifically a unique regional perspective, sort of what value does that add to the conversation? And so I have a rather sort of general list of starting topic points that I wanted to mention, and then I hope we'll get to discuss more of those things in more detail. I think one of the big changes that thinking about unique perspectives at a regional level brings is it really changes the way we think about the categories of what community and what development is and what a region is, and how we define the terms that we use in those conversations. I think much of that framework that we tend to use derives from other non-rural examples, and I really don't that don't always work as well in rural places. So that would be sort of my big overarching comment about this. I think the other things that unique regional frameworks do bring to the conversation is they allow for more unique inclusion of unique perspectives, people that feel that they are part of a specific unique identity that is tied to a region are more likely to identify with a kind of development that identifies that and that works with that as part of what they're promoting in their community. I think that it also changes the dynamic of the way people work on the ground with each other, so that there is much more thinking about the relation of people to each other, of different entities to each other within that broader regional framework, rather than seeing ourselves as more isolated units that are maybe even in competition with each other. And I think it also has this process of sort of sifting to the top the organic, naturally relevant and meaningful practices and I guess I would call them sort of activities that a community does, so that it naturally creates some focus area for development, along which development can continue. So those are some of the things that are top of mind when I think about this. It's a much more in-depth conversation, but I think I would start with those points.
Awesome. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think you hit on a couple really big things. I mean, when we talk about regional identity in New Mexico, we're talking about rural, right? I mean, 1 in 5 people in New Mexico live in sort of rural areas as defined by various metrics out there. And yeah, I think you're absolutely right that it's sort of, especially when we're talking about the creative economy, because creatives are everywhere, not just in cities, right? And we got to figure out, how do we come up with strategies that work in rural areas? And I really love what you said as well about how do we think about ourselves in collaboration with other people in our region, even if we're sort of spread out, right? Even if there's a lot of miles between our house and the next house, that we're not isolated competitors. And so, yeah, I know one person who has traveled many of the spread out miles of New Mexico is our next speaker, and we're very excited to be joined by Molly Boyle, who is the managing editor of New Mexico Magazine, and who has written just, yeah, really wonderful stories and written extensively about all sorts of really all corners of New Mexico, and just terrific writer and a great thinker about all of this. And we're just really, really excited to be joined by Molly today. So I know you've got a little presentation for us, Molly, so tell us a little bit in your travels and your writing and your thoughts about this idea of regional identity in New Mexico.
Yeah, well, I think I just wanted to start by giving like an overview of what New Mexico Magazine is and what we do. So we're celebrating our 101st year this July, America's first state magazine, which
Wow.
started as the New Mexico Highway Journal. The first editor's letter talks about advocates for the need, construction, cost, and maintenance of good roads, as well as the need to promote the attractions of New Mexico as a national playground. So, a lot of those first ads were for tires and like road graders. But we've evolved.
The more things change.
Yeah, I mean, we've evolved, but we've still kind of got that attractions of New Mexico really, really deep in mind. And we're nationally distributed. We have a print circulation of around 40K. We have 25K Instagram followers. When I joined the magazine in 2021, one of my sort of biggest initiatives was making the magazine sort of as essential for in-state readers and in-state travelers as it is for out-of-state. And I think we're working towards that goal still. We are a self-sufficient enterprise with virtually no taxpayer funding. You know, we function as an enterprise fund in state government. So that's how we work. And I've been full-time here since 2021, really focusing on arts, culture, history, food. And I think one of the reasons that I'm on this panel today kind of involves truly my favorite part of my job, which is promoting local businesses, local artists, and just spotlighting really amazingly talented people across the state. And then watching them grow in stature and success. Because oftentimes, you know, if we're doing an article about someone, 4 other outlets are also doing an article about someone. So sometimes it's a race, sometimes it's like, oh, well, who isn't being spotlighted? But that kind of search really drives me. And so I'm going to share my screen just to have some slides to get you sort of thinking about this stuff. And
let me know if if it's not working, because I can share it too.
yeah, it's got me all in the all in the system
And
preferences.
the permissions and stuff. Do you want me to just do it?
Yeah, would that be
Yeah.
possible?
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Let me just
Okay,
pull it up
cool.
very quick. Very quick. We will take a journey into the region of Molly's Canva presentation here. It's tying it back to the topic at hand. We'll click share. Here we go. And yeah, that's number one. That's
Oh,
yeah,
great.
cool.
Yeah, so this
Here we
is,
go.
I'm terrible at bullet pointed slides, but I just wanted to have some images here of some of the artists and makers that we've kind of highlighted around the state in recent years. So, I mean, the magazine has always had an interest in promoting regional identities, and, you know, New Mexico arts and culture in particular just have these outsized reputations nationally. But, you know, we want people to get behind Trading Posts and, you know, the Five and Dime in Santa Fe. And, you know, the goal is to have people have meaningful engagement with creatives all over the state. And, you know, every quarter I have to sit through a larger sort of, we're under the Department of Tourism, so I have to sit through a tourism meeting. And the most interesting part of that meeting is research. So, you know, questions like, what are people looking to do when they come to this state? But not even that, like, after they come, it's like, well, what would you have wanted to do? What would you have wanted to see more of? You know, what would be a more meaningful trip for you? Like, you know, what are your interests? Be they hunting, you know, arts, culture, food, whatever. So again, like, you know, that's just what we do. It's kind of our bread and butter. And we, you know, so I think in talking about that, from a journalistic perspective, we have to talk about storytelling. From a marketing perspective, we have to talk about what I consider kind of, you know, a little bit of a buzzword, branding. So, you know, I consider what a region's story is to sometimes, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you pitch it, be their brand. You know, be it, you know, Rio Grande style weaving, be it, you know, different styles of Pueblo pottery, or, you know, just a really place-based artist, you know, someone like Ed Sandoval in Taos, who paints the old ones that he grew up with along the high road. So we're really interested in talking about, you know, where those stories come from and how they feed into this kind of sense of place. So we can go to the next slide. So I've got 3 examples of recent stories here, and just kind of thinking of like, where does this identity come from? This creative identity, how, you know, how does the landscape feed into it? How does history feed into it? How do people feed into it? And people's sense of their own regional identities. So you can go to the next slide. So we've got a few magazine sections that kind of achieve different things. And I think this is a destinations article, which appears, that's a section that appears every month, and it's a spotlight on a town or region of New Mexico, what's new and what's happening, and how does that place's history, how do the people who have moved there or who have always lived there feed into their creative development, and what are they promoting as part of their regional identity? So here's an article from March about Mesilla, and how basically, Messia's Mexican heritage really feeds into, the way it looks, what people are doing, and how does that Mexican heritage and that relationship with Mexico sort of show up for visitors. So what can you look for when you're visiting that area? You can go to the next slide. And so, sometimes it starts with a question: why are there a million places in Las Vegas, the original Las Vegas, as we like to call it, that sell burnt cheese tacos? And I particularly liked working on this story, because it's an opportunity to highlight New Mexico food history, and the fact that, in San Miguel County, which is what we're talking about, Fabiola Cabeza de Vaca published the very first recipe for a taco in the early 40s. So we get to talk about just those deep, deep roots, but also, the evolution of cultures and sort of how they kind of came together, and why Northern New Mexico in general is just like the place for burnt cheese tacos, and why people make pilgrimages there from Albuquerque, just to get these. And just on like a personal note, I've now heard of like 5 people who have made their own pilgrimages since this article came out. We can go to the last one. Oh, I think that last slide might not have made it. But she's pictured in one of those pictures before, the woman weaving. Yeah, there she is. Rhiannon Griego, who is a new New Mexico resident. She moved here in 2020, and is really getting in touch. She has Indigenous and Spanish roots, and she's getting in touch with her ancestral history through her weaving. She weaves in plein air at sites like White Sands and La Plaza Blanca. So, we're not necessarily always focused on the oldest New Mexicans or who's sort of really from here. And we can talk about that a little bit more, like what does NM true mean from a tourism perspective. But, people who are just really making deep connections with New Mexico culture. So yeah, that's kind of all I have to say as far as that intro.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Molly. Yeah, it's so cool to see those stories and to think about all those examples. And yeah, I really love what you were saying about yeah, like telling the story as, I mean, branding feels kind of, I think, especially, to like the artists in us, it feels crass or something. And maybe even that is like worth thinking about. But yeah, what an incredible place. And I really want to dive into more of these ideas about like, is Las Vegas, what does it mean for Las Vegas to be the capital of burnt cheese tacos instead of, quote unquote, just New Mexico, right? And how do we get that idea out of New Mexico to the rest of the world? And yeah, but yeah, kudos with incredible stories and great work. And I know our final presenter here today has thought a lot about the idea of, you mentioned White Sands and the last story there, Molly, and our final presenter has thought a lot about the idea specifically around southern New Mexico of this sort of unique region, and southeastern New Mexico, and then zooming in even further from there, which I'll let her talk about in more with more expertise than me. But we're very excited to be joined by Dr. DEPREE SHADOWWALKER, who is from Mescalero and is a former STEAM design specialist to the Air Force Research Laboratory, and has we met in Alamogordo actually, and had a really good talk about, yeah, just sort of southeastern New Mexico, and a lot of cool ideas. So I'll sort of leave it at that and let DEPREE sort of tell us about some of those ideas. So thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. SHADOWWALKER. Oh, you're on mute. You're on mute.
See how long it's been since I zoomed.
Yeah, no, you're good. You're good now. We can hear you now.
Working on more hands-on things these days.
Sure. And just
Yeah,
let me
the
know
thing-
when you want me to share that PowerPoint whenever.
Are we sharing everything right away, or?
Whenever you want me to. Just let me know and I'll bring it up. So it's up to you.
Well, if you think it's appropriate, go ahead.
Okay. All right. Hang on
So
a
what
sec.
I had this idea about being two hubs down here in central New Mexico. The east and the west side of New Mexico is kind of more rural than the central part of where we're at. And I was looking at the idea of, well, let me tell you where it became. A while back, we started an Apache Arts Co-op. And so we got into the idea, we talked to, authenticating us artists as Indian artists or American Indian artists, natives. And we invited down the art cultural person that's in charge of I can't remember her official name. But anyways, we invited her down and we had to be certified to be able to say that, brand us as, authentic Native American Indian cultures. And that idea came up, they said, well, what represents, your tribe, your Apaches? And it was like, you think of like weaving with Navajos, you think of pottery with the Pueblos, with the tribes that were less nomadic and various things. And we really, I never really came up with a good idea, other than a lot of us incorporate art in everything we do. And I think that was pretty much what we used to do in the past too. I mean, art wasn't separate from living. And I think that's something that Western civilization has gotten to the point of separating everything out so much so that it could try to capitalize on everything. So let me bring that back around. My background's in education, and I got started in education and learning technologies and started looking at how to mix the two together because they weren't compatible at the time that I got involved in technology. It was like water and vinegar or water and oil. And now it's become, ranch dressing. But you don't get to taste the other flavors of the lettuce, the other flavors of the salad. So I'm like, how can we bring this back together so it makes sense to people? What I find is a lot of people that come to visit New Mexico, they're looking for, kind of a down to earth experience. If it's not about food, if it's not about, it's about history, it's about what, if you want to get really deep about it, you can get into the symbology, but that's, for a deeper conversation at maybe a ceremonial time. And if you get invited and how you feel there and how you act. But the point is that a lot of people don't know much about us. And sometimes even our own tribal members don't know a lot about their history. I mean, even in my own family, I have come from a large family of 9. I'm the oldest. They don't have a lot of history because our parents were basically, traveling or working. And so me being the firstborn, I think I was lucky that I got a lot of cultural stuff from my dad's background and my mom's. But I think my brothers and sisters, they didn't get as much, so they kind of have the watered down version of American history. And the New Mexico Blue Book also never mentioned the Indian history here. And I'm saying Indian because I'm home, and the elderly people, you know, we always came back with Indian, and I know all the political ramifications of that, but we're not going to get into that either. So I thought of a cultural hub. So a cultural hub would be like 2 spots, one in the mountains, one on the desert floor, to connect those 2 regions together. Now we're only like 35 miles, maybe a total of 50 miles from each other, which isn't very much traveling time if you think about it. And having a hub that would, like an art hub, which would have the history of the artifacts or the people or the communities that came there, the desert history, maybe timber and forest and ranchers that came up to the mountains, and then also the ranchers and farmers, people that came in through the railroad down in the desert near White Sands and the Missile Range down there. So sharing the history without it being watered down, and, you know, talking about it and building it up together so that everybody would come and understand the perspective of where everyone's coming from. Because all of us we come from a different history. Not all of us know our history. Not all of us know our biological or cultural background. And it would be a good starting point for those that, you know, want to reconnect to those things or understand the region that they're in.
Yeah, and I know that you had specifically, let me see if I can keep going here. I got a little with this. Oh yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about this specific vision? You mentioned the mountains and the desert, that this sort of specific list, like why this place, like why this list and this region?
Well, because we don't have anything like that. We kind of have spots, you know, a few places that have bits and pieces of our history. And it doesn't really come together, you know, somebody just traveling through, or somebody just coming to go camping, or somebody just coming to go skiing, or somebody just coming to walk through White Sands, you know, and see our fantastic sunsets and sunrises. All those things don't really come together. Three Rivers has the petroglyphs. Lincoln National Forest, a lot of people came up here to, you know, get out of probably the heat of the desert. They couldn't do much farming up here, but it's like a road trip. So it's a small road trip. It looks kind of large there, but it's not really that big. And you could end up with, like, maybe you're here for a couple of days. I know a lot of people come here and stay a week. A lot of people from back east come here. I'm like, how did you end up here?
Right.
I mean, this area, but how did you end up here? You know, that's always been a curiosity to me. But I think what they need to walk away from, I feel a need, so that we all understand each other as citizens of the United States, that we're not all separate, that we have strengths that we can share with each other, ideas that can go beyond, I would say, finances, because sometimes the most creative things are the easiest things, like storytelling. I think a big part of, I asked one lady, I asked her, so how'd you pick this restaurant? She goes, well, I went to the web and I looked up restaurants, and I looked for one that had a story. So a lot of things, even artists, when they sell their stuff, there's a story behind it. You know, why did you pick this image? Why did you pick that image? What does this symbolize? You know, a lot of people don't ask those questions. And a lot of time as artists, I feel anyways, I forget to tell people what it says, because you're like, there it is. My masterpiece. What does it mean? I forgot. So I think it's real important that we have like a cultural hubs, one in the mountains, one in the desert. They're only maybe 45 miles away from each other. talking about the history, talking about the railroad, talking about the forestry, the timber sales, how the Western collided with Indian values, and how, what was going on here. And also the railroad. The railroad came through here. People came up from Mexico, and there's a lot of history here that people just don't know about.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think, yeah, thank you very much. That's a really cool vision. And I didn't know or see the region in that way until you pointed all these things out to me, right? Like this interconnection with that little circle. And even just the fact that the mountains and the desert, like I experienced it, but I didn't think about it, that the mountains and the desert were that close to each other. And that, as going back to what Molly said, is part of the story, right? Part of the brand, if you will. And I think that hub and spoke model and that idea of sort of defining or sort of finding those hub and spoke sort of organic networks in rural regions is really interesting, and sort of a way to overlay an idea onto spread out space, right? Just to take you from one place to another across a lot of space. So I want to kick it off and go back to something that Eva said early on, that rural areas are different, right? Which is a big, it's a big idea. And sort of, I think that we've heard some examples, but I'm wondering, Eva, like, what are some specific ways that you think helping economic development, helping folks make a living in rural areas, or it's just the way it's done is just different than in urban areas?
Well, thanks. And I want to actually answer that question by picking up on a couple things that DEPREE just mentioned, because I think what we're talking about when we talk about those connections, and it's so interesting that you have sort of the desert and the mountain for the tribes, because I think I could almost draw a similar map for the desert and the mountain of the different land grant regions in the area of Mora and San Miguel County, in a way that they're different, but they're also shared and similar. And so I think there are, many places where there are these connections between somewhat disparate communities. And to answer your question, Mike, I think that one of the ways in rural areas where you need to think about economic development is to think about, how do we connect these as pathways? Because that's sort of that's in many cases, one of the only viable solutions is to think of it regionally and create those regional opportunities for people coming to the area to have a road trip, and those sorts of guided trips that are day trips, that are maybe longer, that are overnight, that circulate people within the area and give them a range of different cultural experiences at different locations, yet all in some ways connected and related to each other. And so we might think not just of the land grant communities, but we might think in some of the more prairie-like areas, the whole pioneer homesteading, prairie life activities, and where are the stopping points for that journey and that sort of educational and engaged experiences, which is what visitors are looking for, and that can touch on food to ecological landscapes to, geographical things, to homestead sites that still exist. So I think that's to answer, one of your questions, is the way it has to happen in rural areas is partly working with what's there, identifying the assets that are there, and linking those together in a way that benefits all of the smaller communities in that. And so that gets back to that notion of collaboration and working together. And it picks up on Molly's notion of branding, which is, how do we think about branding for a region that isn't unit-based, but is sort of more regionally based. And I want to mention one other thing, which is about the sort of art integrating into, which is that I think in a lot of traditional communities, and I'm more familiar with the ones in the northeastern part of the state, it's not that people think about art so much as separate, but they don't even recognize the art that is still in their cultural, their historic cultural traditional practices, because maybe it's working with Adobe, or maybe it's creating the kinds of structures or clothing or embroidery stitches that was so integrated into their culture that they don't see that as something that can be pulled out as a creative practice. So really interesting to hear what everybody is saying here, and to think about you know, the ways in which this works in rural areas, or what one has to
Yeah.
do in rural areas.
That reminds me of two very quick stories. I'm gonna kick it over to Molly after that, because I have a question about coming versus staying or coming back, you know? And what you're saying, Eva, reminds me, when I was in Mora, I met a gentleman named Gilbert Quintana, who was talking about all this burnt wood, right? Like from all the fires up there. And he was like, oh, maybe I'll do something with it. I think I'm gonna, you know, just make some sculptures with it or something. And I was like, wow, that's such a cool idea. Like, and he was like, oh, you know, it's just what we do. You know, it's just we have to clear it out anyway. And I was like, wow, like this is something that, I mean, where I'm from in Northern California, we have lots of fires and just the trauma of it, you know, and he was just very casually integrating a sort of trauma response through art into his life, you know, that is just an incredible idea that is a Mora idea, right? It's a Mora idea. And then the other story that it makes me think of is I met this is not a fun visual aid because it's just a business card, but I met this dude in Rama, just a gas station owner. And he, you know, to meet him, he was a very nice guy, Lewis, Alan Lewis. But he, you know, he was just a gas station owner, but he had this really compelling idea to have art in rural gas stations all across New Mexico. And he was like, yeah, we used to do this, but then I couldn't do it anymore because of all, you know, these economic issues. And just those, like, to your point, Eva, about what assets are there, right? And what we don't recognize maybe as breeding grounds for creativity and for the circulation of creativity, but that are woven into the fabrics of these rural communities, right? And so rolling off of that, I want to ask you, Molly, in thinking about tourism, and you mentioned you all think a lot, right, about why people come to New Mexico. And I'm curious in your thoughts, like what are your thoughts about not only why people come to New Mexico for a short time, but what makes people want to stay in New Mexico for a longer time, or even maybe if it's not too ambitious, like what makes people want to come back to New Mexico if they left? Because I imagine you've thought a lot about that. Oh, you're on mute. Sorry, you're on mute.
Hi, yeah, definitely. I talk to people a lot about that. I ask that question a lot. We're working on an issue focused on guided tours right now. And so I went to Acoma the other day, and I you know, had a tour guide from Acoma, and I asked him, who are the people who come back for these tours, you know? And he said, what, you know, I can't, just to paraphrase what he said, it really seemed like people who create a connection there. Whether if it's, you know, he was talking about people that his family has kind of adopted, you know, maybe they came for a tour and he invited them to a feast day, and they came back for a feast day, and then he invited them back for Christmas. And, you know, these are people from Oklahoma or New York, you know, and he was just giving me examples of now people who maybe don't have family of their own, but who come every year for Christmas with his family. And with the Pueblo And I think it's that notion of connection and community that keeps people coming back. You know, I think about a package we did a few years ago focused on DIY experiences in New Mexico. So, you know, you're not just visiting, you know, you're learning, you're taking an intro weaving class. Maybe you're going on a foraging hike. You know, and that kind of thing, you know, oh, I learned something here. I'd like to come back. I'd like to do it again. You know, I had a really great conversation with an artist who sold me a piece. And now every time I look at that piece in my home, I think of the story that they told me about it. But yeah, I think it's really that notion of connection, that notion of really understanding a community, and getting to know just kind of what makes them tick.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I mean, I certainly resonate with that, right? Like the idea, my experience with New Mexico was, yeah, having a friend there, going there once, and going to the farmer's market in Santa Fe and standing around with a burrito and someone just from behind like put a green chili like on top of my burrito. And I was like, all right, well, I think I'm gonna come back maybe for something else, you know? And just, yeah, that idea that you have an experience that's an entry point, but that entry point is part of, in this very organic, sincere way, like a package of, and I mean, even saying package makes me cringe a little bit as I hear myself say it, but that's, you know, that's what it is, right? Like you
Right.
come back for Christmas, you come back for these really important times. And I want to ask you, DEPREE, something you said about how art is woven. You're trying to think, well, what's our specialty? And you're like, well, we don't have one. Art is woven into everything we do, which really strikes me, if there is like a commonality across New Mexico creative identities, it's that, right? Like to what Eva was saying as well. And what I wonder about in where you are, and this idea of, because I remember going there and visiting you and hanging out in Mescalero with you, and I was just sort of curious about, and I'm not sure if I can connect these in a really obvious way, but the idea of coming back in the sense of like, do people leave Mescalero, and do they like ever come back if they leave? Because that was like a question I had floating in my mind the whole time I was there. Does that make sense? Oh, you're on mute again. Sorry.
Again. Oh,
Yeah,
there
you're
we
good
are.
now. Yeah.
Do you mean tribal people or people from the border towns or?
Whatever sort of strikes you as the way you want to answer that.
Well, my lifetime, well, there was a story that you always get called back to where you were born. And I think that's kind of like why we always say, where are you from? And when you ask a Western person where they're from, they're like, well, you know, well, 2 weeks ago, or is it, you know, I just moved here, or, you know, been here, lived someplace else for 5 years, or, and it's always centered around work, you know, career, something like that. It wasn't like a choice that they made, or they made a choice, I should say it that way. I said it backwards. So here in my lifetime, in my generations, I've seen people say, we were pushed to leave because there's no jobs here. We're so rural. There's no careers. There's limited resources. The people that are in positions of, you know, having economic stability, they usually stay in those and, you know, age out. And so, and for us, aging out could be, you know, 70. Well, it used to be. It's probably not that anymore. But I've seen a lot of like my high school friends come back. And a lot of us come back, we're like, we miss the connection to the land. We miss the connection to the community. We miss uh, the sense of freedom that we have here that you don't get in the city, where you know, the hustle and the bustle. And even though you have more resources there, it's okay to visit, but it's not always the right place to stay because it's just sometimes uncomfortable for some of us that come back home. You know, we long for the sensibility of the land, I guess is one way of talking about it. And so, and we like knowing each other, you know. I saw this article. I don't know if this is off base, but here we go. This guy, he was talking about his is an older man, and he was talking to his younger children, and they were saying, "Well, Dad, why don't you use technology?" And I was probably on that crazy Facebook forum. Why don't you use any of this technology? You know, you can go to the bank, you can get your groceries delivered to you. You know, you won't need to depend on me to come and drive you over there, or you know, you can also, you know, you can do all this online, Dad. You know, you don't need to go to all these places. You know, and he thought about it, and he goes, "Well, that's true. I could use technology and go to all these places, but I wouldn't know, you know, that so and so's son was having a hard time. I wouldn't know about the fresh fruit that's coming from this other place, you know, that somebody else is growing down the road. I wouldn't have the conversations that I have, a connection with the people." So we're talking about storytelling, connection. Connection comes with having conversations, how small or big they are. You know, they connect us to each other, and it doesn't always have to do with the amount of time we spend, but it's more about the quality, you know, of what you're sharing and what you want to impart with the passerby.
Yeah, and it strikes me that so much of when we and this is like a generalization, but in hearing you tell that story, it strikes me that we talk about going to these amazing places, and this is also something I want to shout out Molly, because I feel like your work turns this on its head in a really good way. But we talk about going to these places and experiencing them almost as ghosts, right? Like non-entities, not having any kind of interaction or conversation, and just having sensory input, right? Like, ooh, I like, but what you're talking about, DEPREE, is like, we are part of that relationship. Like this driving to see that fresh fruit, like I bring myself to that too. I don't just experience it as something like an amusement park for me, you know. I'm part of that relation. And I think that that's something that people crave in general, and I think it's something that is really possible in New Mexico's sort of more spread out areas. We have one question in the chat: how do we finance the idea of these pathway tours, from Jessica Roybal, which is a good question, a real brass tacks kind of question. I think that with the new Creative Industries division, that's a great idea for something that the Creative Industries division can focus on and look at, and certainly something that we've been looking at in our research to recommend. But I also want to shout out some of the, and not to put you on the spot, Molly, but I maybe want to shout out some of the tourism and New Mexico True programs that I might not even know about, that you might know a little bit more about, that folks out there maybe with some of these business ideas or ideas might be able to take advantage of. Is that putting you two on the spot? You're on mute. We're having a real mute fest on this one today.
Yeah, I feel like I have not been on Zoom for a while, thankfully. But yeah, so I think that might be it's definitely something that tourism thinks about probably more than the magazine does. But you know, it's in terms of like engaging with the magazine, there's a link on the tourism website about like sort of how to engage with the magazine, sort of how to get your business out there and on our radar. But even more than that, you know, we've talked about what to do with people who are featured in the magazine, kind of helping them leverage that opportunity as much as they can. You know, whether it's sharing, you know, whatever was written about them constantly on social media, or, you know, from a tourism standpoint, like what, you know, getting branded as a New Mexico True business, You know, yeah, I mean, I think that's just kind of where we approach it from, just kind of, you know, how do you get that foot in the door in terms of marketing, and then where do you go with it? Who do you share it with?
Yeah,
So
definitely. And oh, sorry. Go ahead, DEPREE.
I throw out this idea. It's like we all are trying to do the same thing, but we're not all working together. So I was thinking about like tours. My dad, as he got older, you know, he looked for jobs, certain jobs. He used to be a very physical person, you know, worked in
Mm.
construction or doing all kinds of things. But as he got older, he had collected so many stories. He had such a unique life that he fell into this tour bus, a shuttle bus driver. And he was just doing shuttle buses.
Wow.
He ended
Cool.
up telling him what he knew about northern New Mexico and about his own life. And in the sense, people were buying paintings that he made. He started to make paintings, and people would want to, you know, see his paintings. And so then he would show. They tell him, "Well, come by my house, and you know, you can see my paintings." So I was thinking about this, you know, idea of tourism. If we scheduled tours, you know, people will pay for it. We don't have to worry about how it's being financed. You say, you know, you build it, you say, here it is, this is how much it's going to cost. Do you want to include meals? I mean, they do this with the, you know, doing the workshops all the time. And then sharing that schedule with the local places that you're going to stop. You know, maybe you're stopping in this very rural area. Is somebody there? Is it during apple harvest time? You know, is it during the time that they're doing the cherry picking? Is it during the time that they're doing log carving or working art? Or you're just stopping at our local plaza. We have like a little plaza too, gas station, you know, to refill and see what. So you let the small vendors, the small business owners, and people in Mescalero are they sell a lot of food because that's the easiest thing to sell. And everybody loves food, and we don't have no fast food on the reservation, thank God.
Right. Right.
So if we all work together, and that becomes, you know, sort of intergenerational, because maybe we could hire or the tour buses or the shuttles to get them from here to there can show integrate some of the storytellers, the older people that have a history, that can talk about what they saw there and what, you know, I helped build that church, or I helped build that road, or, you know, and this is what my great, you know, for me, it'd be my great grandfather, or it could be my grandpa, or it could be my dad. But anyways,
Yeah.
share
Yeah.
about these ideas and talk about, you know, how people came here. I mean, there was Irish people that came here. There was Jewish people that came here. You know, the people got off the boat over in Ellis Island and came here. Why did they come here? You
Yeah.
know, there's so many things to explore that, you know, people haven't even thought about it.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think that's a really beautiful idea. And as we wind up here, I mean, this this one in particular, I feel like I wish we could talk for hours and hours. But I do want to say to your point, DEPREE, that in just numbers research, that actually one of the sort of creative sectors that's had the highest compound annual growth rate between 2015 and now is scenic and sightseeing transportation in New Mexico. So the numbers actually agree with you there, which is kind of interesting, I think. But yeah, we've heard some wonderful, really cool ideas here on this panel, and I really, really appreciate everybody taking the time thinking about these tours and regional collaboration, thinking about these really specific stories, like different places being the birthplace of certain cultural things, like Molly highlighted in the story about the tacos from Las Vegas. And I think one thing, just to sort of wrap us up here, that it strikes me listening to all three of our really wonderful panelists, is that there's really just no such thing as empty space. Like New Mexico is full of quote unquote empty space, but as DEPREE was saying, it's not at all, right? It's full of stories. And so long as you have the right kind of collaboration, like Eva was saying, to get people out there and to fill up the stories, I think you're totally right, DEPREE. Like, that's entrepreneurial. People will pay for that experience, especially, you know, in the world that we live in right now. People are craving those kinds of experiences.
And we have to think outside the box, you know, we can't make it a job, you know, like part-time things. You know, some people show up for it and some people don't. It's not like, oh, we're gonna ding you because you didn't show up and you didn't do this like you said you were gonna do. I mean, as the need arises, you know, more people show up.
Right, right. And I think, yeah, I think that's a great place to leave us here. And we'll be sharing out some resources for folks, things that people have talked about in a follow-up email. But yeah, thank you so much again to Eva and to Molly and to DEPREE for joining us and sharing all these thoughts today. I feel really good. I feel really excited about these ideas, and I hope folks watching do as well. All right, I'm gonna head off to another, I don't know exactly which one, but I'm gonna figure it out. And thank you so much for being here. And I invite folks to join the rest of the panels today as they can during the heat wave. Thank you all
Nice
so
meeting
much.
you all.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care. Bye.
Later.